Hello everyone. Last time we have talked about the properties of classes, structures, and enums. And today we'll talk about the methods. Let's look at a class as an example. We have a class counter and it has a property of count equal to 0. And then we have a method increment which will increment the property of count. We can also use self.count. This is the same thing, and I would recommend always add self because it will make your code more clear. The next function is increment by. It has two parameters, amount and times. And if you look at how this function is used, c.increment by 5 times 7. So the second parameter has an external parameter name called times. This is because of a Swift rule, which says that for the methods, the first parameter by default doesn't have an external parameter name, but all the subsequent parameters have default external parameter names which are the same name as the local parameter names. So in this example, times is not the first parameter, so it has a default external parameter name of the same name. The second method has a sharp in front of the first parameter. As we talked about before, this means that this parameter has an external parameter name of the same name as amount. And the second parameter has a customized external parameter name. So increment by 2 is used like this. Increment by 3 has a customized external parameter name for the first parameter, but the external parameter name of the second parameter is suppressed with the underscore. So when you call the increment by 3, you have external parameter name for the first parameter, but not for the second parameter. As a summary, we have talked about two scenarios where a parameter has a default external name. The first scenario is when a function parameter has a default value, then that function parameter has a default external parameter name of the same name. And second scenario is what we talked about today. All method parameters except the first parameter have default external names. So far we have talked about the language syntaxes that are common to class, structure, and enum. Now let's talk about something that is specific to class, to structure and enum. Here we have an example of counter2, which is a structure, and it also has a property of count, which is a var. And in the method of increment, we want to increment the property of count. This will not compile because for structure, by default, a method cannot modify the structure's property. If you want the method to modify its own property, you have to define this method to be a mutating method. Now it compiles. And a mutating method can not only modify its own property, it can even reconstruct itself. So the method of reborn is basically creating a new structure and assigned to itself. Note that a class cannot have this kind of renaissance. Some usage example, we have a CS, which is a counter2, cs.increment, now the count become 1, and cs.reborn, the count is reset to 0, because CS is reborn. If we have a constant of counter2, cs2, as we talked about in previous video, the property of a constant structure cannot be modified even though the property is a var. So count cannot be modified even though count is a var. And if we go along the same line, a constant structure should not be able to call the mutating functions because mutating functions do modify the properties. So that is also the case. You cannot call cs2.increment. In last video, we have talked about type properties. Type properties are the properties that are shared by all instances of the same type. Similarly, we have type methods. Type methods are the methods that are shared by all instances of the same type. So for example, we have a class, some class, and it has a method, some type method. This is a type method, and it is denoted with the keyword class. And this is a method shared by all instances of the same sum class. So we can do sum class dot some type method to invoke the method. Similarly, we have a structure, and a structure's type method is denoted with the keyword static. And then we can do some structure dot some type method. Enum is very similar to structure. So here we have a enum, some enum, and it has a static type method, and it has a regular method, and it has a mutating method. So as you see, it is very similar to structure. And if we have enum that is a constant, you cannot call the mutating method. And if you remember from previous video, a enum can only have computed properties. A enum cannot have a stored property. So enum have very limited support for property, but it has a very good support for methods. Lastly, let's talk about subscript. A subscript can make your object look and feel like an array or dictionary. For example, here we have a class, and this class has a subscript that takes an integer as a parameter, and its associated value is an optional string. And it has a getter and a setter, so you can both read and write through this subscript. And then if we have a s equal to string set, s10 equal to word, this is calling the setter of the subscript. And then s10 will return optional string contains word. This is calling the getter of the subscript. And if we do s10 unwrapped, it will return word. It also has a subscript that takes two parameters, a row and a column. And because of that, we can call s to 4. So this makes s look and feel like a two-dimensional array or a matrix. And note that for this subscript, we have only defined the getter. We haven't defined the setter. So that means if we do s21 equal to hello, this is an error. So this subscript is read-only. Also note that when you only define a getter and not a setter, you can omit the keyword get. And the parameter to the subscript doesn't have to be integer. It can be any data type. So here is another example that takes a string as a parameter. And for that, we can call s hello. One thing to remember about using subscript is that you have to make sure the subscript makes sense. In other words, the meaning of the subscript is aligned with its meaning in the dictionary or array. Thank you for watching. Feel free to download the notes from my website and practice with it. See you next time.